What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be discussing off-balance and how off-balance works. I've seen this come up a lot in the ESO subreddit as well as in a couple of discords I'm in, and it seems like a lot of people have there's a little bit of confusion as to how off-balance works and how that kind of plays into raids and group composition and things like that. So hopefully today I'll be able to clear up some of those questions and misconceptions that people have about off-balance. Now the first thing that we want to talk about is what exactly is off-balance, and why is it so important. So off-balance is a status effect. Let me see if I have a pause here. Alright, so off-balance is a status effect. You can see that right there. It's basically is something that is set by blockade of storms. Doesn't really matter which morph of that ability that you use, as long as it is using the lightning staff whenever you put down your elemental blockade or unstable wall of elements. If the enemy is concussed, then it will be set off balance. Now why is this important? It's important because of a passive in the ritual tree known as Exploiter, which increases your damage done against off-balance enemies by 10%. Now this is why off-balance uptime is very important, because you want to get as much uptime as you can on off-balance to get that extra 10% damage. Now stamina DPS will always have the Exploiter passive active, because all the passives in this tree are all related to stamina DPS. Now most, if not all, Magicka DPS will put 75 points into Thaumaturge in order to get that Exploiter passive. So that's how Magicka DPS get that the passive there. So that's kind of why off balance is so important. Now, I said earlier that it can only be applied by Elemental Blockade or Unstable Wall of Elements. You can see here, Blockade of Storms or Unstable Wall of Storms sets concussed enemies off balance. And what's important to note there is enemies need to be concussed in order to be set off balance. So now what exactly is concussed? Concussed is an elemental status effect that is applied from most sources of shock damage. So anything that deals shock damage has a chance of setting the status effect concussed. Back in, I think it was patch 4 or not 1.4, maybe 1.3, it was a while ago. ZOS basically standardized how this probability works out. So you have the shock damage enchants, weapon damage enchants have a 20% chance of applying their appropriate status effect. So for shock damage, that's concussed. For flame damage enchant, that's burning. For a frost damage enchant, that is chilled. For a poison damage enchant, that's obviously poison. And for disease damage enchant, that's going to be defile. So there's a 20% chance for your enchants to apply their appropriate status effect. What ZOS calls standard abilities have a 10% base chance of applying that status effect. Now, damage over time abilities, single target damage over time abilities I should say, have a 5% chance to apply the status effect per each tick. Area of effect abilities have a 3% chance of applying a status effect to any enemy that is hit by the area of effect, and every area of effect abilities that have a damage over time component, for example elemental blockade, those have a 1% chance to apply their respective elemental effect. So that's how you can get concussed. So it's basically anything that deals shock damage will leave concussed. Now light attacks and heavy attacks, as far as I know and as far as I've tested, cannot set enemies concussed. So I'm going to repeat that again. Light attacks and heavy attacks, as far as I have tested and as far as I know, do not apply elemental effects, whether that's burning from fire staffs, chilled from ice staffs, or concussed from lightning staffs. I have not seen any concussed uptimes, mana vulnerability uptimes, when I just spam a target skeleton with light attacks. So at this time, light attacks and heavy attacks do not seem to proc any sort of elemental status effect. So basically, it's just everything else will have a chance of applying it. Now that chance is obviously increased by the trait charged. Charged on a two-hander weapon increases the probability of a status effect being applied by 220%. On a single-handed weapon, it is 110%. So for example, if you have a charged lightning staff or the charged staff with a shock damage enchant. When you have that shock damage enchant proc, it has, instead of a 20% chance, that's the base, it has a 64% chance of applying concussed. So that's kind of the only sort of modifier that you have on the probability of applying concussed. So do note that Elemental Blockade itself can actually apply concussed. It has a 1% chance of doing so. So if you're just using Elemental Blockade, you can set enemies off balance, but the probability of that happening is very, very low. So for example here, I have a Inferno Staff with the Fire Damage enchant, and I have a Lightning Staff Nirnhoned with an Absorb Magicka enchant. So if I just put down my Elemental Blockade and Wall of Storms, you'll see that I am not actually setting the enemy off balance. So you can see up there in the upper left-hand corner of the health screen, you can see that I have my buffs up there from Shundar, and you will see that I am proccing Burning from Grothar's proc. Grothar can proc Burning, but you do not see any sort of concussed or off balance. There we go. So now we see that you can actually set enemies off balance. And you see that there is no real downtime on the off balance. You can see that the off balance is was refreshing itself as long as I had minor vulnerability up. So you see it's just repeating itself over and over and over as long as minor vulnerability is up. So minor vulnerability is concussed. They're pretty much synonymous with each other. So you can see there that I can actually apply off balance with a lightning staff. However, you can see it doesn't seem to happen very often. So that's kind of the thing there. The other thing, like I mentioned earlier, was that off balance continued to refresh itself as long as the enemy was concussed. So elemental status effects, when they are applied, have a 4-second duration, and that can be refreshed if it's reapplied via a shock damage enchant or flame damage enchant or whatever like that. And so elemental blockade deals 1 hit of damage every second. So 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. You can see every 1 second you have that damage tick going on. So if an enemy is concussed in the 4 seconds that's happened, every 1 second afterwards, as long as your elemental blockade is still up, it'll refresh the off balance uptime. So it'll go back up to 4 seconds. So off balance has an uptime of 4 seconds. So it'll just keep refreshing it back to 4 seconds, back to 4 seconds, back to 4 seconds, as long as you have concussed up on the enemy. Now, a lot of people talk about consuming off balance. So what exactly consumes off balance? The most obvious example of this is going to be your heavy attack. So whenever you block an attack in the overworld, you stun the enemy, and if you have the in-game combat cloud shows up, it says that you have stunned the enemy and you have set the enemy off balance. And when you heavy attack the enemy, you deal some extra damage and they get knocked down. So that's kind of what we mean when we say consume off balance. When you deal a heavy attack or some other ability that supposedly takes up off balance, that's what we mean. So basically you're taking the duration, that 4-second duration gets immediately cut from that point when that ability is done. So if, let's say you manage to set an enemy off balance with your lightning blockade, and then you have a stamina DPS in the group, use a heavy attack within the first second, that extra 3 seconds of off balance is immediately cut off. So you lose that 3 seconds off balance uptime, but like I said earlier, as long as your blockade is up and the enemy is concussed, it'll reapply itself immediately afterwards, or I should say, right when that elemental blockade ticks, the next tick happens. So that's what we mean by consuming off balance. So what consumes off balance? Obviously heavy attacks do, and then mag DKs have an ability that also consumes off balance, and that's their Flame Lash. So whenever you have an enemy that's off balance and you're targeting them with Flame Lash, it becomes Power Lash. So that consumes the off balance, but it is a free cast of Flame Lash. It deals much more damage than it normally does, and it also heals you. So that's kind of why mag DKs are kind of not desirable right now, because of that additional off-balance consumption. So when we talk about off-balance uptime, we're really talking about how much off-balance is the stamina DPS taking away, and how much off-balance are the Magicka DPS and the healers able to give out. So off-balance uptime, this is a very common misconception. Off-balance uptime depends on 2 things. First of all, how many times are you able to proc concussed on the enemy? If your enemy is not concussed, as we saw, even if you have blockade of elements down 100% of the time, If your enemy's not getting concussed, you're not getting that off balance. So the first factor in determining off balance is how often is your enemy being concussed. So that's why shock damage glyphs are kind of the big thing now, because shock damage glyphs have that 20% chance of proccing concussed. When you have 4 Magicka DPS with 4 shock damage glyphs all going off at this, every 2 seconds, you have a pretty good chance of concussed being applied to the enemy for 4 seconds. And then of course you have your healers. If they decide to use a Magicka shock damage enchant on one of their bars, that increases the chance of getting that concussed uptime going on. If you have an Asylum Staff, as long as the conditions are met, you're guaranteed to be applied concussed to the enemy. So those are kind of the first step into determining off-balance uptime. The second step is obviously how many lightning blockades you have down. As long as you have a lightning blockade down, you will be able to continue to maintain off-balance uptime. Again, as long as the enemy is concussed. So now a lot of Magicka DPS are running lightning blockades in order to help maintain off-balance uptime. Realistically, you only really need 1 lightning blockade to maintain 100% off-balance uptime. As long as whoever has that lightning blockade is able to keep it up throughout the entirety of the fight, 1 lightning blockade can actually give you 100% off-balance uptime, as long as, concussed is also 100%. That being said, the more lightning blockades that you have, the more ticks of lightning blockade you have, so off-balance gets refreshed faster. So if you have, let's say, 4 Magicka DPS and 2 of their blockades are kind of off sync with each other, because blockade ticks deals 1 damage every 1 second. If you have it so, 1 blockade deals damage and then a half a second afterward the other blockade deals damage, both of those hits have a chance of refreshing that off-balance uptime, so it results in higher off-balance uptime as your stamina DPS start to consume it with their heavy attacks. So those are the 2 things that you need to keep in mind when you're trying to make your raid group. How much concussed uptime do you think you can get? So that's kind of dependent on how many Magicka DPS you have, how many shock damage glyphs are you running. And then the second one is how much off-balance uptime can we get? And that's going to be determined by how many Magicka DPS are running lightning blockades. So that's kind of what you want to look at when you're looking at your raid composition. Now, stamina DPS don't have any source of applying off-balance or concussed unless they decide to use a shock damage glyph, but then you're running into the whole, you're not really optimizing yourself to do stamina DPS. But stamina DPS play a very big role in determining how much off-balance is consumed, because pretty much every single stamina build in this current meta uses at least 1 or 2 heavy attacks in a full rotation. Well, for example, Stamina DKs, on their front bar, they're running 3 to 4 heavy attacks. Stamplars running, I think, also around 3 or 4 heavy attacks. Stam Sorks, same thing, 3 to 4 heavy attacks. Only Stam Blades are only really running maybe 1 or 2 heavy attacks per full rotation. So the more stamina DPS you have in your group, the harder and harder it is to maintain off-balance uptime. That's when it starts becoming very important that you talk with your Magicka DPS and say, hey, you need to run shock glyphs on your front bar to maintain a concuss, and you need to run lightning blockades so we can continue to refresh at off-balance uptime. So that's kind of the deal with off-balance. It's not just simply lay down your elemental blockade and you automatically have 100% off-balance uptime. There's a lot of factors in play that determine how much off-balance uptime that you actually have. Now, a good number to shoot for in a raid scenario, you have to play mechanics, people are dying, things like that, is around 80%. You want to shoot for 80% off-balance and minor vulnerability uptime. Ideally, these 2 numbers should be very close to each other. If they are close to each other, that basically means you're refreshing off-balance as soon as it's consumed. So whatever your minor vulnerability uptime is, should match your off-balance uptime. If your off-balance uptime is lower than your concussed uptime, your minor vulnerability uptime, that's when you know you have an issue of your off-balance being consumed faster than it is being replaced. In this scenario, you're going to want to replace some fire blockades with lightning blockades in order to increase the uptime of off-balance, or have your stamina DPS switch to Magicka DPS, because clearly the blockades are either not getting maintained throughout its duration like they should be, or your stamina are just consuming so much off-balance that the blockade can't, when it refreshes itself, it just immediately starts getting consumed over and over and over and over again. So that's kind of what you want to look for. You kind of want to make sure your minor vulnerability uptime and comment metrics is equal to or equal to your off-balance uptime. Off-balance uptime will usually never be that much higher than your minor vulnerability uptime. If minor vulnerability uptime is lower than your off-balance uptime, something weird is happening there. Basically, what's happening there is you're probably it's a very short parse or something, or because basically what that means is because you need concuss in order to have off balance, you always have higher minor vulnerability uptime or slightly higher minor vulnerability uptime compared to off balance uptime. So if your minor vulnerability uptime is decreasing, then something weird's happening. It's probably just a glitch in comment metrics. So that's basically it for off balance. Let me know down in the comments if there's any other questions about off balance and things like that. So one thing that I highly recommend you guys do in your trials group, maybe bring this up with the raid lead, is figuring out just how many lightning walls do you need in order to maintain your off balance uptime. If you have, for example, the group that I run with most often, we normally have 4 Magicka DPS, and that's plenty to maintain high off-balance uptime. When we have 6 Magicka DPS, we did a couple of tests, and we found out that the ideal number of lightning walls versus firewalls is we want 3 lightning walls and 3 firewalls. That's enough to maintain off-balance uptime without dropping group DPS, as long as obviously all the Magicka DPS are using shock damage glyphs, because again, concussed uptime is what off-balance uptime depends on. So that's something that you guys need to figure out for yourselves for your own individual groups. If you're running, for example, with 6 stamina DPS, I don't know any groups that's running that many stamina DPS, but on the off chance that you are, you are going to want to see if one of those stamina DPS wants to swap over to Magicka DPS, because at that point you're starting to run into the problem of there's not enough concussed uptime, there's not enough off-balance uptime, and you're going to end up losing DPS. So that's something you want to consider, and that's something that's going to be unique to each raid group's situation. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.